Hello, you're listening to the Super Power You podcast. This is episode 106. I'm Lisa Betts-Lacroix, and today's episode is Let's Get Loud.
Welcome to the Super Power You podcast, where we reveal the mental models and tactical skills needed to activate your inner superhero. And here's your host, Lisa Betts-Lacroix.
Hello, lovelies. This is Lisa Betts-Lacroix. Okay, here we go. Today's show is a bit of an edge for me. It is a solo show, and well, initially I thought I would do a how-to show, and I was planning to share 10 tips from my speaking skills courses. And then as I was preparing, some deeper stuff was coming up, and it was calling out to be presenced here. And as I was thinking, threads of thought started to interweave in my mind. And so my short 10 tips episode got a lot more involved. And as a result, I am recording and posting today on Friday instead of yesterday, Thursday. The bottom line is this: it is time to speak up. It is time for us to tell our stories. So yes, the speaking tips are important. Speaking training is important. And it's important mostly because, in spite of a lot of cultural conditioning to the contrary, it's time for us, women especially, and yes, you men too, but women especially. It's time for us to show up, speak our truth, tell our stories, and be seen. And I know for a lot of us that is scary. I know lots of you listening right now feel like your little life, your stories don't matter. Or maybe you just don't know where or how or when to share it. And that's the reason I do training on speaking coaching. That's why I was wanting to share ideas for how to be more effective when you do speak. But first, we have to be aware of all the ways in which we have systemically been conditioned to not speak up. And we have to be willing to presence that, to become conscious of it, to take responsibility for where we've internalized it, and to change that. We have to get real about the fact that we live in a culture that does not welcome our voices, that certainly hasn't been seeking them out, and that at times has even diminished our voices or conditioned us to shut each other up, conditioned us to silence each other, because sometimes someone somewhere benefits from our silence. So all of those patterns are at play and have, in most of us, to some degree or another, even been internalized. And they can have us feel, they can have us even be invisible. So it can take extra effort for us to show up and speak up and encourage each other and celebrate each other. But it is so important. And it's so deep, friends. It's so deep. These days, I am feeling like there is just so much more on the line. Like, really, it's an imperative now that speaking up and sharing our stories and making our voices heard, declaring our boundaries, holding space for each other, amplifying each other's voices, all of that is so necessary, and necessary that it becomes the status quo. That the status quo becomes that we talk. It's critical and necessary for the changes we want and we need to see happen in our culture now, because nothing will change for us, for our daughters, and for the world at large until we talk. So telling personal stories has always been really important to me. And in fact, this show is all about amplifying the voices of amazing women, mostly men too, but amazing women telling their stories of resilience and creating space for authenticity and emotions and to celebrate our strengths and our power. And I know it deep in myself that when we tell our stories, we deepen into the meaning that those stories hold for us, the meaning that we are making from our experience as individuals. And we also, in telling our stories, forge connections and understanding with those witnessing us in the telling, the receivers of our stories, in communities, in gathering spaces, in circles of women, that we are modeling what is possible. In the early days of my career, I was a film and television actor. And while I'm so lucky to have worked in many, I think over 100 episodes of network TV shows, of movies of the week, of feature films as a featured performer or guest star or recurring characters on TV shows. And I had the opportunity to work with some super well-known, extremely talented people. I was super lucky in a very difficult industry. But the part of acting that I loved most was the training, the self-exploration, and the personal growth, which is necessary when you're an actor. I mean, it's just what any good actor has to do as part of studying the craft. You have to go deep into self-understanding and into the understanding and psychology of human nature. And I know this goes against most people's thinking. It goes against our cultural stereotypes about actors. But I am here to tell you, guess what? Actors as a group are so smart, super brilliant, and deep human beings. I loved the personal growth that came with acting and the seeking of understanding in classes and with other people and in training situations, all about human psychology. I loved that aspect of acting. And I actually also loved auditioning. I loved dressing up and pulling out of myself a wider range of the characters that live inside me and all the various parts of myself. I loved the challenge to expand that range and to increase access to all the parts of being human. So fun. So fun. But in my early 30s, I left the film business to raise my kids and to independently educate them and to spend a lot of energy over the last couple of decades building parenting and gifted support and independent learning communities, and to speak on and raise awareness about the future of education and learning and where it's all going. And so when I left acting, I never expected that I would come back to it because there were at that time very few roles in television and film for women over 30. Women in media were, with very few exceptions, pretty much disappeared after about 35 or so. Our stories were just not told. Most of the writers, directors, and producers that I personally worked with were men. In fact, I can say that all of the directors I worked with were men, with one exception, and it was a notable exception. I got to work with Kathy Bates on a pilot for a TV show, and she was the director of it. So that was a wonderful exception. But in general, all of the stories, all of the decisions, all of it was made by men. And while that's changing, and it is changing, there's a tipping point happening in our culture where women are speaking up and saying it's time for us to show up. Unfortunately and unbelievably, there's still a very long way for us to go. And here is the key. This is the theme of the show. This is what came up for me as what needed to be said today. And I don't even know if I'm going to get to the 10 speaking tips. We'll see when I get to the end of this more essential, deeper part. The reason it's starting to change, the reason everything that is changing in our culture is changing, is because women and other underrepresented populations, people of color, otherly abled people, people of various ethnicities and cultures, people of varying degrees of access and privilege, people with bodies that represent the wide range of the human experience, people of all ages, including ages which have in the past been considered no longer relevant. People are showing up and speaking up like never before. All of this to say that this is relevant to you because your stories matter. It does not matter who you are. Your stories matter. Representation matters. It matters that we see ourselves in the media. It matters that we represent ourselves and show what we know. It matters that we show up and claim our space. A couple of days ago, I watched an interview with Emma Thompson on the BBC about the harassment and predation that is in the film business. But also it's in our culture in general. It's endemic when extreme power imbalances exist. In that video interview, Emma Thompson was essentially talking directly about how our lack of representation in the film business has contributed to the problem in Hollywood of abuses of power. And she gives voice explicitly to the fact that there is a systemic imbalance. There's simply not enough women holding positions of power in Hollywood. And in fact, she says there aren't enough women, period, in all industries. And at the end of the video, Emma Thompson says, perhaps this is a moment when we can say to men and women, open your eyes and open your mouths. We cannot allow this to continue. People have to be called out on their behavior all the time. She's recognizing the inequity that exists in the power structures in our culture, which have too often in the past led to situations where there can be abuse of that power. And now Emma Thompson and so many women are actually explicitly and directly speaking out about this. This is what the Me Too movement was about. But in the past, we've collectively been somewhat silenced for fear of, well, all kinds of things, victim blaming, the fact that when positions of power are held by men, speaking up's often had extreme repercussions. It might have meant the possibility of even fewer opportunities being available to us. It might have cost us the relationships that we were in or potential damage in our connections with men. It might even have cost us relationships with other women because we have been culturally positioned in competition and comparison with each other. And let me just be clear that I am not talking about men. I am not talking about victimization at the hands of men, except when it specifically is that, like in the case of the Hollywood situations that Emma Thompson's talking about. What I'm talking about here is a systemic patriarchal history and culture we have been raised in, which impacts all of us, men and women. And all of that has become internalized on so many levels, so we don't feel, in many cases, like we can take up space, like our voices matter, like there is room for us, like it's safe to speak. And now is the time for all of us collectively to change that. Now is the time when there is a rising up, when we can see it everywhere. There was this Super Bowl halftime show thing that happened in the last couple of days and the follow-on hoopla. And I don't know if your social media threads were anything like mine, but it blew up over this past week. And that is so powerfully relevant to what I'm talking about because it addresses representation. It addresses getting loud and speaking up and taking up space. It is relevant because it's illustrative of all the different ways that we are positioned against each other, even as women, and all the ways in which when we do show up, we're kind of told we shouldn't. I've been so fascinated to see how alive our collective processing has been. And it has us talking about beauty. All kinds of Latino girls were on stage along with J-Lo, who is 50 years old. And then it's raised discussions about what does it mean to have our sexuality present. And you could either see it as flaunted in inappropriate ways or celebrated and claimed. And all of the layers of variations of how people watching interpreted and are now speaking about that. And then there's people of color speaking up proud and excited to see themselves represented maybe for the first time. There was so much richness in the halftime show by J-Lo and Shakira, and so much complexity around the results that came out of it. And the first comments I saw to pop up on social media were actually derogatory ones. They were comments about stripper poles and, oh, wow, I could have done without all the crotch shots. And, oh, what if our children were watching? What kind of message does that send to our girls about what it means to be female? And this is another illustration of male fantasy and how women show up in those forms. But then the nuances showed up and the celebrations began, and so much recognition of pride about the lushness of the Latina spirit in that show, and the number of friends and women in the media, Latinas, saying they wept for seeing themselves on stage was profound and intense to recognize how much of an unusual situation that could be for people. To maybe for the first time see a stage full of women, a stage full of people of color standing up and saying, "Hi, we're here," and commanding attention in all the ways. And there was the Puerto Rican flag and a showing of such athletic strength and power, cultural representation, singing in Spanish, and 2 women headlining the show. And how did they show up as primary performers taking that stage? They showed up in collaboration, in partnership, in sisterhood. This was an example of women speaking and performing and singing together in massive groups of all ages. People were celebrating Shakira and J-Lo as inspiring examples of vital older women, 43-year-old mother, 50-year-old women rocking the stage. Because yes, we've had generations of men doing this. We've seen the older men rock tours, but women showing up, women being featured in this way, taking center stage, is new and so refreshing. And there's this appreciation, this happiness from so many people, and seeing our female curves, our bodies, and even our soft bellies on a national stage. So while some people that I know, some friends said, this is an example that we can't live up to, the reality was there was Shakira with her beautiful belly dancing belly that's kind of real. And not everybody has that exact same belly. Some people have thinner bellies and flatter bellies, and some people have bigger bellies. And the reality is that we don't have to look the same. There's a reclaiming there of our sensual and our sexual expressiveness as valid and powerful. So deep, so rich. I know so many women who watched that and just felt so much excitement and pride and relief at seeing ourselves, our bodies, our sexuality, and our presence represented. And the complex reality is that there were others who felt the show denigrated us as women. There is so much to unpack when it comes to our representation in the world as women and how we perceive ourselves and it. The reality is that we come from so many different histories. We have our own individual stories and lives and circumstances. We are all going to make completely different meanings from these circumstances. But one that I want to address is the concept that we should be protecting our daughters from this dancing that represents us as sexualized or sexual beings. Well, I heard a news commentator, and what she said was, for those of us who come from other cultures, this isn't over sexualization. This is just dancing. This is us being fully alive. And I do think that there are some elements of cultural bias that we need to pay attention to that come up when we interpret other cultures' dance. And in fact, there was so much cultural representation in that dance and so many different types of dance celebrated and claimed. But I think this idea of shaming, in some ways, we're kind of between a rock and a hard place in some ways, because on some level for women, no matter what we say, no matter what we do, no matter how talented or skilled or or the level of artistry we show, no matter how much we might work at our craft or our purpose, there's going to be someone somewhere who's going to decide that they can or should be the judge of whether or not you're dressed or behaving appropriately. And to that, I say, no. No. Other people do not get to decide when you or I are behaving or dressing appropriately. The judges will chime in. We come from this long history where whatever you do, they'll say, don't show your body, don't be sexual, don't be beautiful in any way that might make someone else feel bad, because we have been we've been steeped in this culture and this history that we have to compare and compete, that we are naturally in competition with other women. And it is those voices that I want to shout over. It is that idea of comparison and competition that I want to replace in order to protect my daughter's psyche and her self-worth and her sovereignty and her access to sisterhood and collaboration and connection with other women, with friends, with sisters, with mother, with daughter. And by the way, a lot of this goes back to the lack of representation, resulting in a lack of power, resulting in a lack of financial equity. When we do not have financial parity, we become disempowered and we are more prone to feel in competition and in comparison with each other. But I'm here to tell you that when we compare ourselves to other people, we are making that choice to do so, and we can also choose to not. We can choose to celebrate our own gifts and celebrate another person's gifts in a way that does not take away from ours. This is transformational. This is a big change. This is revolutionary to how we have been conditioned as women. This is where we need to get loud. All of the issues that come up in situations like this, and how women are represented, how we see ourselves, and how we judge each other. When it comes right down to it, there are two major points I feel we need to consider. The first one is we need to find ways to speak up. We need to talk. We need to share ourselves, and we need to hold space for each other while we do it in a way that says no to any shaming of another woman. We don't have to be the same. We don't have to have people do things the way we do them. We can celebrate ourselves and each other, and in doing so and in getting loud about it, that's when we will transform the world. So please join me in this. I am going to end the episode here. I'm not going to do the speaking skills, but I am going to do that in the future because I want to share some of the tips that I have developed over the years through my Rock Your Talk and Speak for Yourself courses that I think can help you, can help all of us as we find our voices, as we find our stories, as we speak up, and as we get loud together for ourselves and each other. I think what I might do is to provide those top 10 tips on a Tuesday's tips episode for the next 10 weeks or for 10 weeks in the future. So keep your eyes open for that. I'm going to end the show here. And for now, until next week, I send you, as always, big love.
Thank you for listening to the Super Power You podcast. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes and get more information at lisabl.com.